Welcome to another edition of Director Tech Talk. I'm James Wyngaard from Rice Lake Community Media and being joined by Derek Westby, the Director of WTCO TV in Trempealeau County. Hello, Derek.
Hello, James.
Good to see you again. It's almost like did this before.
Almost. We're getting better at it.
well, we're certainly trying anyway. And so before we get into the topic of today's show, let's talk a little bit about our show. Of course, here in Rice Lake, we have a radio and TV station, and Derek has been nice enough over the several months that I've been here, 8 months now, or so as we tape this, to come up and help with some rewiring and kind of improvement projects around the station. And a couple of times he's come up, he's said, "Can we do a radio show?" And I said, "Well, sure. And what do you want to do?" And then because both of us are in the TV and tech world, we decided that we were going to do a tech show. And so that's how this kind of was born. We've done a couple of specific on radio, and now we've kind of branched out, and we're doing a couple of shows, or more than a couple of shows is what it will be on both radio and TV. Right?
Yes. Yep.
Good. That's why he's the best co-host in the business, friends. So the topic today that we're going to talk about is TV technology. Very convenient considering we're both in the TV world. And so when we look at TV technology, we have to, if we start in the beginning and we go all the way back to the 20s and the 30s when RCA and all those companies got into the field in the first place. Is that a good place to start, or do you have other places that you'd want to start?
We can start there. In 1927 was the first successful completion of a signal to television. And that was done by Philo Taylor Farnsworth. So anybody who watches Futurama, there's, Phil, and Dr. Farnsworth. So I wonder where they got that from. There were some experiments before Farnsworth with mechanical television and stuff like that, but it just didn't work as good. And then RCA licensed from Farnsworth to use electronic television, which is the basis of all TV we have now. And in 1939, RCA did their first broadcast from the New York World's Fair with FDR. So FDR was the first president to ever appear on television. And back then, it wasn't a huge thing. It was kind of, a experimental market. And the first TV screens were very, very small. They were 5 inches by 12 inches. So, I think, like my laptop screen is significantly larger than the first TV. So that's pretty rare that something that would start that small would get to, what are we at, like 85-inch, 120-inch monitors now?
I think so, and then you get into video walls and everything like that, and you're talking feet, 6 feet by 8 feet, or if you go to, I guess a scoreboard at a stadium, football stadium or something like that isn't a traditional TV, but still, we're talking now, 100 feet by 120 or something ridiculous, and so, yeah.
Yeah, and so broadcast television first came to Wisconsin in 1947. So that was when television production first went into full scale, where people could start buying TVs for at their house. That same year, WTMJ in Milwaukee went on the air. And then it didn't hit Madison until 1953, which ironically coincides with the invention of color television. So in Madison, the first station that came in was WKOW, but that's when color TV started, and it had 525 lines of resolution. So if you think of it, that's 500 little tiny lines to make your resolution, which is now, sub standard definition at this point. And in the the late 80s and early 90s, the FCC put out a request for proposals for the future of television, and that's how we've started getting into this more digital television. And back then it was 480 by 640, so 640 lines of horizontal resolution and 480 lines of, or I have that backwards, 480 lines of horizontal resolution and 640 lines of vertical resolution, which is the 480 standard that we all knew and loved until we started getting into the HD market.
So let's talk about that. Let's get into some of these definitions. I've got some written down here that I'm going to quiz you on now. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. So high definition, HD, actually has, I think, four that I can think of off the top of my head, four different basically levels of HD, right?
Yep.
So we've got two in 720 and then two in 1080. What's the difference, and then you've got 1080p, 1080i. What's the difference between all of those?
Well, 720p and I, they have the same lines of resolution. It's just a different encoding method. So the I is interlaced and the P is progressive. Some devices are particular between I and P. Some, they don't care. So, for example, in our control room here at Trempealeau County, we have a computer that's hooked up to our TriCaster. And the only way to get that signal to come through was to make it interlaced, where most monitors like to put out progressive because it's a slightly clearer picture with the technology they're using. But the 720 standard is 720 horizontal lines of resolution. And then, so it's 1280 by 720 is the pixel ratio. And then once you, and 720 came out in 2001. So it's been out a long time. It's been out, 20 years now. Then not long after, 11 years later, 1080 came out. And that's considered full high definition. Before it was high definition in 720, and then when 1080 came out, they called that full high definition. And that's 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. So that's kind of where TV is now switching over towards 2 and 4K. But before 2 and 4K, 1080 was the top HD.
And not to necessarily pull back the curtain on all of TV's secrets. However, some stations cheat a little bit in what they propose is, or what they purport is high definition, and they actually broadcast in what's called 16 by 9, which isn't true high definition. It's just the aspect ratio to make it look like that, and you get the bars on the top and the bottom, but it's not true high definition, correct?
Correct. 16:9 is just an aspect ratio. So 480 had a 16:9 aspect ratio. So standard definition has that. It just, it's just how they lay it out. So, for example, your channels up in Rice Lake, those broadcast still in standard definition, but again, there's that cheating you can do where you make it 16:9 and it looks better. Where some stations are still in the 4:3 ratio, the more square, and some stations are still broadcasting in that.
Right.
But there is definitely that way to kind of make it look better when you don't have an option to go HD.
Enhance the product without enhancing the product.
Yes.
Right. So then, one thing that you mentioned that some people may not be familiar with. So we know the HD quality, and then we're now, of course, all hearing about 4K. You know, a lot of people probably have a 4K TV at home, but you also mentioned 2K. What does that mean?
Well, 2K is I guess only slightly better than 1080. It's double the pixels, so I guess it's twice as clear. Where 4K is, 4,000. The K stands for 1,000, so it's 1080 was 1,080. 2K is 2,000. I don't have the exact pixel
It's just doubled,
ratios
so to
for
be,
those.
yeah, 2160.
Yeah, and 2K and 4K came out exclusively as cinematic formats in 2005. So when you went to the theater, it was so much clearer, which would help people go to the theater and watch a movie because it was crystal clear, beautiful video. Well, 4K has actually been around significantly longer than that. It was actually invented by Hitachi, and Hitachi came out with 4K in 1984. But it wasn't commercially available. It came out kind of as a monochrome, so it wasn't full color, but it was the basis of 4K, which is really a nice thing. 4K projectors came out to consumers in 2004, but there was nothing in 4K yet in 2004. And then 4K television came out in 2012, but again, there was nothing in 4K. Now we're getting into the 4K with streaming and IPTV, less on the coax cable side because they can't support 4K through coax.
Right. Yeah. So the conduit to which you receive your signal, and if you go back to a previous program that we did on Wi-Fi and kind of that sort of technology, is really determinant as to the quality of the signal that you're going to get either on your computer, on your cell phone, on your television. And now we're looking at jumping up all the way to 8K, and Sony is the big proponent of this. I was at a conference in Las Vegas a few years ago and walked through a display that they had set up about 8K televisions and formats and things like that. And to be honest with you, I am not entirely sure that I could really notice that much of a difference between 4K and 8K. But now you look at some sporting events and you see the broadcasters with those field shots that look like maybe they're handheld and they've got the blurry background and everything looks like so crystal clear, sharp. Well, those are 8K cameras. So maybe there is an advancement in the technology that we've gone through over the last 3 or 4 years that now are bringing that sort of technology to American homes.
Well, and there's a lot of benefit to shooting in a higher resolution than you're broadcasting in. For example, if I were to be recording this in 4K, which I'm not, I'm recording it in 1080, I could digitally, in editing, double what I'm looking at. So I can zoom in on different parts of my shot. Where right now I'm in 1080, if I were editing in 720, I could zoom in again. So shooting in 8K, even though most people are just now getting into 4K television, you still broadcast in 4K, but then that shot you have that's huge can be zoomed in to this little tiny, the dimples on a golf ball, if you will. You can zoom in on that without losing any quality because you're shooting at a higher quality than you're editing at.
And that is kind of the name of the game because you get to do a whole bunch of things that you don't get to do necessarily in real time in the post-production part of the whole video process.
Yes. And like you said, with those football games, those are done more or less in real time, but there's a team of people that are taking footage that was recorded, dumping it in a computer and zooming it in. It's not, you're not always seeing exactly what the camera saw at the time the camera saw it, because a lot of this is replays where, you know, they're zooming in to see if the foot crossed the line. But that is so much of a huge team, which, you know, you and I don't have a team of 37 people to do just the production truck during a football game. So us in community television are limited by staff, not what type of equipment we can have.
Well, to be fair, we're a little bit limited by the technology as well, because if we had the technology that you know, CBS has or ESPN or something like that, we would be bankrupt. Because as we all know, you know, when 4K, if you recall, 2012 is when you said that 4K TVs came out, correct?
Yep.
And remember how expensive 4K TVs were back? You know, they were $3,000 and $4,000 and $5,000. Well, now you can get a 4K TV for $250. 8K TVs, which is what we're at now, are at where 4K TVs were back then. They're $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Granted, you can get a 4K TV for that amount too, but 8K TVs are at that, and I would imagine, if history repeats itself, which it is wont to do, I would imagine that eventually, somewhere down the road, an 8K TV will get down to a much more manageable number for John Q. Public and your typical consumer.
Well, and talking about community television has been around for a while, but we're always a little behind because we don't have the millions of dollars to invest in things. There are some stations that have just finished going 1080 pre-cable. So a majority of the stations in the state are still broadcasting in standard definition because they're required to by their cable provider. There's 4 that I know of that are members of Wisconsin Community Media that broadcast in HD. One of them is Titan TV in Oshkosh because they do over the air. One of them is WTCO here in Trempealeau County because we have a small cable company where our channel is a prime channel, one of their main selling points. Then there's Reedsburg. They're broadcasting in HD because the city of Reedsburg owns the cable company. And then there's a channel out of Westby, Wisconsin on Vernon Communications. They're owned by the cable company. So the pattern here is if you're going to be in HD as a community channel, you either have a really small cable company or you're owned by it. The big cable companies has started pushing community television into Siberia, you know, like Charter and Mosaic up there in Rice Lake have pushed you. You know, I think you started on channel 14.
We were on
and they pushed you.
channel 14 for a long time when we first started, and I think we ended up on channel 69 for a while, and now, you know. And this isn't a complaint by any stretch of the imagination because Spectrum and Mosaic or Select, you know, at the very least they still have us on and you know, we're on the program guide and everything. And you know, to find us though, it does take a little work. And granted, you know, we've been in what they call the, the neighborhood network up in the 990s in digital, and then prior to the switch over to digital, you know, we were in the 90s for a long time. But you're right, it's a bit of a challenge when you're not necessarily easily found, and you know, then you have to start relying on other ways of getting your word out: Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and your website and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and while we're talking about cable, do you know where cable started, James? Like the whole concept of cable access television, where the whole service came from?
Where did cable start?
Well, it started where people in valleys couldn't get the broadcast channels. So the person who owned the tall hills put up an antenna and would sell you a line to your house from that antenna. And that's the whole part of cable access that started. And then it started to snowball into these big cable companies. And then, satellite got in there in the 60s, and then it started switching over to IP television in the 90s when the internet was coming out. And in 1992, the first video streaming came out, which was very archaic and didn't work as good as it does now. But it's been out for a long, long time now. So that's why, the Netflix and the Hulu and all of those providers are getting better at what they do, because they've been working on it for a long time.
Sure, and that just goes without saying, because the longer you're able to kind of tweak and test and turn and the systems, the better off I think you're eventually going to be. And I think that's the same. Well, I suppose that could be said about pretty much anything, really. The more you practice at it, the more you're able to kind of tweak things, the better off your end product is eventually going to be.
Yeah, and we're in community television, and community television as a whole is celebrating 50 years this year. And the first community television channel in the United States actually started in Wisconsin, down in Stoughton. There's so many conflicting dates on when that started. It's sometime between 1968 and 1971 it went on the air. And that was done by Bob and Jean Burrell. They owned a very small cable company, and when it took more effort to sell cable, they launched a channel, and that's how we got community television. And WTCO, which was originally Trempealeau County Community Television, or TCC-TV, is actually celebrating 40 years. So they were 10 years. We were 10 years behind the whole cable television channel world, but that's not that far, considering some stations went on the air 10 years ago.
Right, yeah. And I just off the top of my head, I want to say that here in Rice Lake, we've had a channel probably since at least the early 80s, if not maybe the late 70s. Mick Givens was here for a long time, I think 17 years, something like that. And then, of course, Ryan was here before me, and now I'm here. And there may actually have been a person in before Mick, too, but I haven't done the research on it, and I probably should. But, yeah, so, it's interesting to see where community television has the roots in it. And, you talk about WSTO, both you and I have a history there, and for quite a long time. And I thought it was interesting a couple of years ago, that old parade of Ascent to My Parade was found back from, I think it was back in the 70s, was it not?
1973.
Yeah. I was going to give away an age, but I won't. So, but yeah, it's. I think it's wonderful to be able to have this hyper local media, and I'll tell you that I did my first internship in community television was actually at the two cable stations in Milwaukee, which unfortunately don't exist anymore, but it was wonderful. I got to do a talk show kind of like this, and they had a couple of different studios, and it was really, really a neat venture to be a part of.
Well, and in community television, we've been lucky over the past year that our services to the community have become so important. With COVID and people not getting out to events and not being able to get to their government meetings, community television has really stepped in and said, we're here to help. And that has had a tremendous impact on community television and the communities that we serve. Here in Trempealeau County, we did regular updates from public health. We've done meetings that we didn't do before that people are like, oh, that's great, now I can watch it. So there's just been so much, a resurgence almost of community television.
Right, yeah, getting out and doing the meetings and doing the parades and, just kind of getting back out there and as we tape this program, we're getting ready to get into the fall sports season across the state, and I'm sure stations across the state are going to be broadcasting football games and soccer and, into the winter with basketball and hockey and wrestling and everything else, maybe swimming and diving and all that sort of thing too. So yeah, it's a, and I suppose we both have a vested interest in it, but I really and truly do think, and I've been a part of community television and productions actually going all the way back to my high school days. So I'm really pretty much 30 years into this at this point, and it's interesting to see, as I mentioned before, kind of where we've been and where we're going, and I think a lot of people say that the future of cable and community television is not exactly bright, but as long as we kind of adapt to the times and work together to make sure that we're still moving forward, I think it's one of those things that we're really going to be, I think, pretty proud of.
Well, yeah, we've seen declines in cable service purchases, but we've seen an uptick in people watching on our websites and on Roku and Apple TV and Fire TV and all these apps. People are starting to go that route. So we definitely see where cable, as we know it, is changing, but people are still flocking to get that high school football game from last week and all of that. And I see that we're getting kind of low on time, so we'll kind of move on.
We'll wrap things up, yeah. So I guess we kind of started talking about the technology of television and kind of veered off a little bit into community television, but we certainly hope that you enjoyed our information that we were able to bring you, and that and we'll certainly look to bring you more information on future programs across a lot of different topics. And I would say that if you have interest in the topics that we're talking about, do be sure to kind of do your own homework as well. If you're looking at a new television or a cell phone or whatever it is in the tech world, take our information kind of as a historical and a very high level information, and then make sure that you're doing your research and making sure that you're getting the best information that you can for the situation that you're in.
Absolutely.
All right, with that, we will wrap things up for this edition of Director Tech Talk. I am James Wyngaard, the Executive Director of Rice Lake Community Media.
And I'm Derek Westby, the Director of WTCO TV in Trempealeau County.
And this has been Director Tech Talk, and we'll see you next time.